Let's jump right into working on the stencil portion of our cake. So here we've got our pretty stencil. This is our pretty flower and leaf stencil. And we've got our vanilla ganache. Now our ganache is naturally a very yellow tint. So we need to whiten this up because we don't really want a yellow background on our cake. So I've got my white airbrush. Now this airbrush comes completely filled this color, and it's got a very, very little bit of the pigment at the bottom and a whole lot of activator. I don't find that it works very well for me with that much activator in it. So I actually pour this into a pot on my stove and I boil out the activator. It leaves just the really concentrated white at the bottom for me. You could also use a white gel if you had that at this step. So we're just going to mix this into our ganache, and we're going to kind of keep going until we've toned out that yellow. So you can put as much white in at this point as you need. I do not recommend doing the dot of purple trick that you do with your buttercream to take the yellow tone out. For whatever reason, it is not very successful with ganache and it will tone purple almost instantly. So stick with just using your white. And you can see I'm kind of going to keep going until I feel like I've gotten most of that yellow color out. And we're doing pretty good now. So what we don't want here is a weird yellow stencil on our pretty white cake. It would just look off. So now my cake at this point is not condensated. It's not wet. I can touch it. It's not sticky. If yours has come right from the refrigerator, go ahead and let it sit out for a little while. Let that stickiness and condensation come off. Otherwise, like you just saw me put that stencil against the cake, it will stick and it is quite a mess. So let it come to room temperature before we start this next step. If you're using, and I hope you are, our concrete ganache foundation, you're going to be just fine. So let's go to the back of our cake. I always recommend starting new techniques at the back, just in case something goes wrong. Now, the spatula here we talked a little bit about in the tools section. This is just from the dollar store. It's really cheap and it's really easy for me to bend. And you can see I've got quite an angle on this. When I put this against the cake, it's going to create a very flat portion against the cake, as opposed to if this was at the normal angle, I'd only get the very, very tip. This flat portion really helps me when we're doing the palette knife portion, which is what we'll do next. So let's go ahead and grab our stencil. Now, we're not going to be stenciling this entire cake. We're going to use little bits and pieces and portions of our stencil. So you can see I'm just going to hold this on with my fingers. I'm going to pick the portion or part that I want, and I'm just going to push it on. Now, I'm not pushing it on super hard. I don't want anything to bleed under my stencil, but I am putting a good bit on. This is not just a little bitty, not a whole lot exercise. We want a good bit on there because when we pull it off just like that, we want to see a nice raised portion on our stencil. Otherwise, we'd have this little kind of, it wouldn't be able to be seen very well. And that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a nice raised portion. So let's go on to the next one. So I'm going to find a different portion on my stencil that I want to use. So let's put it again, just right up against the cake. You can see how much I've got there on my palette knife. And I'm just gently pushing it on. I'm going over the area that I want to stencil out. Remember, we're not stenciling the entire cake. So at this point, we're just using small portions of our stencil. You'll pull right back, and there we go. We've got two done. And you can see it's picking up the leaves and the little flowers nicely. Right here, I want to go a little bit more towards the bottom. I kind of want my stencil to be all over when portions are peeking through the other elements on our cake. So I don't want to go right down the middle. I don't want to just do the top or just do the bottom. Really proportion this out and do a top and a bottom and a middle and different sections of your cake, so that, like I said, when the other elements are sort of peeking through, we can see a little bit of stencil here and a little bit of stencil there. Now, if your stencil is getting too thick at any point with the extra ganache, you can go in and you can wash it. You'll notice I'm not going to wash mine during the top, but I will wash it in between the top and the bottom. So now that we've got a little bottom on this portion of the top tier, let's do a little bit on the top. And you can also stencil some on the very top if you'd like. See how nice that looks? We can see some leaves and we can see some vines. Let's do a little bit more in this back portion right here. And flip your stencil over. Flip it around, top to bottom. Just don't flip it back to front because we don't want the extra ganache to get on our cake. So we're just going to do a little bit more here. And again, how we're talking, it's not a super duper thick amount, but it's not a little thin amount either. And you're not scraping it off like you would if you were stenciling the whole cake, if you've done that technique before. So we're really piling this stencil up. We're not scraping off when we're done. All right, I think that looks really nice. And again, at this point, this is probably where you're going to want to go and wash your stencil. When you wash your stencil, I need you to be really, really mindful that you are getting it completely dry. Oh, and then look at that. See right there, I just did a little bitty flower. So you can come back in and you can just do little tiny portions at the top and the bottom. Again, we're going to dry our stencil really, really well. Wet stencil is not going to work against the cake. And let's talk a second about the consistency of our ganache here. So you can see it's not flowing off my spoon. This is a thicker ganache. This is thicker than we would use to cover with. It's not flowing, it's not liquid at all. So here's our nice clean stencil. And again, I'm always going to advise that you start on the back of the cake. If something goes wrong, if you don't like the technique, it's so much easier to hide a mistake on the back portion of the cake than it's going to be to hide a mistake in the very, very front of the cake. So here we go. We're just doing, again, thicker, and we're just selecting pieces and parts of our stencil. Oh, there we go. Look how pretty that one is, how it got the vine really nice in there. Okay, and since we did that one on the middle, let's do another portion here, and let's go with an upper portion. And again, if you need to clean your stencil off, take it to the sink, wash it really good, and then dry it super thoroughly. The wet stencil is not going to hold the pretty shape of our ganache. It's going to let the ganache seep underneath. It's going to stick to your fondant. It's not going to be good. So there we go. We've got two different ones. And now let's do some here on the bottom. And right here, you see I've kind of turned to the front of my cake. Since this particular design is not going to have flowers in the front, I do want to make sure that I've got a nice portion of the stencil able to be seen from the front, and that I don't have just a big blank space in the front of my cake. I want to make sure I've got some stencil there for some visual interest. Now, I realize at this point it might be looking a little odd to you with the sort of sporadicness of the stencil and how we're not following any particular pattern here. But we've got a lot of elements and layers that are going to be happening with this cake. We've got the stenciling, we've got the palette knife technique in that beautiful periwinkle blue, we've got sprinkles, we've got flowers, we've got leaves. There's a lot of layers that are happening here. So right now, this is just the very bottom layer. So you're not going to see a huge amount of this stenciling when we're done with the cake, but I do want it to be something that catches your eye. I want it to be something that is a little bit textured. I really like texture with cakes. The other trick I will tell you with texturing is if you've got not such a great base, so not such a great smooth fondant tier, which if you've gone and you've watched our Fondant Foundations class, that would not be a problem, but let's pretend you haven't. If you have not such a smooth foundation at this point, this stenciling is really something that can help you cover little areas like that. All the texture that we're adding can really help cover some maybe not so perfect spots on your foundation. But go watch the Fondant Foundation class. That's going to teach you everything about torting, filling, ganaching, and putting your fondant down. So now we're almost done with our stenciling. We've just got a little bit more here on the back to go. And if at any point your ganache has started to thicken up too much on you and it's gotten to where it's difficult to spread with your palette knife, your spatula here, pop that ganache in the microwave. I don't recommend you do it for any more than about 10-second bursts. Since we don't have a huge amount of ganache in our bowl, we don't want to microwave it for very long, or else it's just going to become a runny mess and we can't use it in this particular technique. Because again, at this point, we need a thicker ganache, but we don't want it so thick that you can't smooth it around your stencil. So if you need to microwave it, 10-second bursts, and then come back, stir really well. If it's too thin, give it just a few minutes to set on the counter and you'll be good. So, oh, look how nice that last one looked. Can you see the little flowers and all the vines and the leaves? This would be a really pretty stencil to cover your whole cake in at some point. So now I'm just going to use sort of the edges of the stencil. If I've got a large white area with no stencil, I can kind of come in and I can do just a little bit of flowers or maybe just a little bit of leaves, just something tiny that your eye can kind of see. But, and this is a really good point, if you don't like something you've done, this technique is very forgiving. Grab your acetate smoother or any sort of small spatula or scraper that you have. Go in, scrape it right off. The fondant's going to be fine. It's not going to go anywhere on you. And the ganache, even when it does set up pretty hard, it's still going to be relatively easy for you to scrape off if you've made a mistake. So don't worry about mistakes. Mistakes are really easy. Grab your acetate smoother, just scrape it right off, no problem. And then we'll go back and we'll add another little bit. So this is about it for our stencil. And in our next little portion, we're going to go on to the palette knife technique. We're going to dye the remainder of our ganache that pretty periwinkle blue. So right now I'm just spinning my cake around, making sure that I'm happy with the coverage I've gotten on the stencil. If you've got anywhere where you feel like you've got a huge white portion, go ahead, do, a little tiny leaf, a little tiny flower. And I'm going to do a little bit on the top here too. Since this is a two-tier cake, it would be pretty common for your guests or your clients to see that top portion. So just put a little bit up there too.